A battle-scarred Navy SEAL walked into the thick coastal fog, hoping to disappear completely from the world. But at the edge of a crumbling and dangerous pier, he found something that stopped his hollow heart. A starving German shepherd sat entirely alone, shivering in the freezing ocean spray, staring out at the violent waves. The loyal dog was stubbornly waiting for a master who was never coming home. When the broken soldier and the grieving stray finally locked eyes in the mist, neither of them spoke a single word. But in that crushing silence, they both realized they were no longer alone in the dark. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. The fog didn't just blanket the coastal town of Oakhaven, it swallowed it whole. It was a living, breathing entity, a creeping, heavy mist that muffled the violent crashing of the North Atlantic waves and completely muted the vibrant colors of the world, leaving behind an endless canvas of melancholic gray. For Mason, a man whose internal emotional landscape had long since faded to a stark, unfeeling monochrome, this dreary, isolated weather felt less like a storm and more like a sanctuary. Mason was a seasoned Navy SEAL in his late 30s. He possessed the broad, imposing shoulders and the rigid, hyper-vigilant posture of a man whose body had been forged in the fires of conflict and who was still waiting for the next ambush. A jagged, faded scar cut a distinct line across his strong jawline, serving as a silent, permanent testament to the brutal realities of his past overseas deployments. He walked the damp, slick cobblestone streets with heavy, deeply measured steps. The collar of his faded camo jacket was pulled up high against the biting coastal wind. The uniform was merely a functional garment to him now, a remnant of a life he was actively trying to distance himself from, yet it clung to him as stubbornly as the nightmarish memories he couldn't outrun. His soul felt hollowed out, scraped entirely clean by the relentless, crushing demands of duty and the agonizing, senseless losses that inevitably accompanied it. He hadn't come to this forgotten town for a vacation, nor for a fresh start. He had come to simply disappear into the mist. The town of Oakhaven operated on a slow, methodical pulse, strictly dictated by the rise and fall of the tides. Local fishermen repaired their heavy nets with rough, calloused hands, and the thick, comforting scent of salt spray mixed with fried clams hung perpetually in the cold air. Seeking a brief, temporary respite from the damp chill that seemed to seep straight into his bones, Mason ducked into the salty Siren. It was a small, warmly lit, slightly run-down diner that smelled intoxicatingly of freshly roasted coffee and old, varnished pine. Behind the chipped formica counter stood Martha, a local fixture in her mid-60s. She had kind, crinkling eyes that held decades of town secrets, a flour-dusted apron tied securely around her waist, and a warm, welcoming smile that seemed entirely out of place in Mason's grim, guarded world. "Morning, stranger. You look like you brought the weather in with you. Coffee black, just like the sky out there?" she asked, her voice melodic and effortlessly maternal as she reached for a steaming, well-used glass pot. "Just black. Thank you," Mason replied. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, polite but offering absolutely no invitation for further small talk or pleasantries. He kept his steely gaze fixed downward on the cracked linoleum of the counter, acutely and uncomfortably aware of the curious, lingering glances from the local patrons huddled quietly in the vinyl booths behind him. He was a glaring outsider here, a solitary, menacing shadow drifting through their tight-knit, peaceful community, and he vastly preferred it that way. Human connection was a liability. He dropped a crumpled $5 bill on the counter, took the heavy ceramic mug, and stepped right back out into the swallowing mist, leaving the fragile warmth behind him. The shoreline was a desolate, breathtakingly beautiful stretch of rocky, unforgiving beach. It was scattered with massive pieces of pale driftwood that looked remarkably like the bleached, forgotten bones of ancient sea monsters. Mason walked slowly along the water's edge, his boots crunching loudly against the stones. The rhythmic, thunderous crashing of the freezing waves offered a chaotic, natural white noise that temporarily, mercifully, drowned out the screaming ghosts whispering relentlessly in his mind. The ocean was vast, fiercely untamed, and entirely indifferent to human suffering, a harsh reality that Mason found deeply, strangely comforting. As he walked further away from the safety of the town center, the jagged outline of a dilapidated structure began to materialize through the thick, swirling fog. It was the old fisherman's pier, a crumbling, tragic skeleton of dark, rotting wood that jutted defiantly out into the churning gray water. Half of the massive wooden pilings had already succumbed to the relentless pounding of the sea, snapping like twigs over the years, and a rusted metal "Keep Out" sign hung precariously by a single, squeaking chain. It was a dangerous place, totally abandoned by time and utility, which made it the absolute perfect destination for a man feeling exactly the same way about his own life. As Mason drew nearer to the ruined structure, his sharp tactical vision, rigorously trained to detect the slightest anomaly in highly hostile environments, caught a sudden disruption in the jagged silhouette of the pier. At the very end of the rotting dock, perilously close to the precipice where the violent waves crashed upward against the decaying wood, sat a distinct figure. It wasn't a reckless teenager or a stranded fisherman. It was a dog, a large German shepherd to be exact. Even from a distance through the obscuring mist, Mason could easily tell that the animal had seen far better days. Its once proud, majestic black and tan coat was terribly matted and coarse, plastered by the dampness to a skeletal frame that was far too lean for a dog of its breed. The dog sat completely motionless, a silent, tragic sentinel carved from stone, its pointed ears pinned back against the wind. Its gaze was locked unwaveringly on the distant, invisible horizon. The freezing, biting ocean spray washed over it with every powerful, crashing wave, soaking it to the bone, yet the noble creature did not flinch, did not whimper, and most importantly, did not retreat a single inch. It just watched, and it waited, defying the very elements themselves. An unexpected surge of intrigue pierced sharply through his usual emotional apathy, prompting Mason to slowly, cautiously step onto the groaning wooden planks of the pier. He moved with the quiet, deliberate stealth of an apex predator, his boots instinctively avoiding the rotten, treacherous boards that threatened to give way into the freezing depths below. He didn't want to startle the animal, knowing firsthand from war zones exactly how cornered, frightened, and traumatized creatures could react. "Hey there, buddy," Mason called out softly. The gentle, reassuring words felt completely foreign and incredibly rusty on his tongue. The German shepherd's ears twitched ever so slightly at the sudden sound of a human voice, but it didn't immediately turn its head. It took several long, agonizing seconds before the dog slowly, almost reluctantly, tore its intense gaze away from the unforgiving ocean and looked back over its bony shoulder. The dog's face was deeply weathered, a patch of distinguished gray fur dusting its muzzle, and a heavily faded, frayed canvas collar hung entirely too loosely around its thin neck. But it was the dog's eyes that stopped the seasoned combat veteran dead in his tracks. They were a deep, intelligent, piercing amber, swirling violently with an absolute ocean of profound sorrow and an unyielding, heartbreaking determination. In that singular, suspended moment in time, completely surrounded by the deafening roar of the raging sea and the blinding white of the oppressive fog, the battle-scarred Navy SEAL and the abandoned, broken stray locked eyes. No words were needed. Mason saw his exact own reflection mirrored in those amber depths, the exact same hollow exhaustion, the exact same stubborn, irrational refusal to let go of a ghost, the exact same silent, agonizing suffering. It was a profound, immediate, and unspoken recognition between two lost survivors, stranded on the very edge of the world, both desperately waiting for something, or someone, that was absolutely never coming back. Mason walked away from the crumbling pier that first morning, but the haunting image of the stoic German shepherd was permanently burned into his mind. He returned to the small, fog-drenched streets of Oakhaven, seeking out a local hardware and bait shop to grab some basic supplies for his rented, drafty cabin. The bell above the door jingled weakly as he stepped into the dimly lit store, which smelled strongly of motor oil, damp earth, and dried kelp. Behind the cluttered wooden counter stood Elias Cobb, a burly, weathered man in his late 60s, wearing thick flannel and a faded trucker hat that barely contained his unruly gray hair. Elias had hands like worn leather catcher's mitts and a booming, gravelly voice that commanded the dusty room. Mason picked up a coil of heavy nylon rope, a lantern, and a tarp, placing them quietly on the counter. "Saw a dog out on the old pier," Mason stated, his voice flat and perfectly controlled, trying not to sound overly invested in the town's wildlife. Elias paused, ringing up the items on an ancient brass cash register, and let out a heavy, deeply empathetic sigh. "That'd be Echo," the shopkeeper rumbled, leaning his considerable weight against the counter. "Breaks my heart just thinking about him. He belonged to an old-timer who lived up on the ridge. A few months back, the old man took his skiff out before a bad squall hit. The boat washed up a week later, splintered to absolute hell on the jagged rocks at the point. The man didn't. That dog, though, he somehow managed to swim ashore. Ever since that terrible day, Echo marched himself right out to the edge of that rotting wood and planted his paws. Rain, shine, or freezing fog, he just sits there, waiting for a ghost to sail back into port." Mason listened silently, his jaw tightening as the familiar ache of survivor's guilt flared in his chest. "The town had tried to take the grieving dog in," Elias explained, "but the shepherd was fiercely independent, slipping out of borrowed collars and chewing through thick ropes just to get back to his post. The locals eventually gave up trying to forcibly rescue him and settled for occasionally tossing scraps his way, though he rarely ate when anyone was watching." Mason nodded slowly, grabbed his canvas bags, and walked back out into the mist. He understood that battered dog better than he understood most living people. The next morning, the coastal chill was especially biting, gnawing aggressively at the edges of Mason's faded camo jacket as he made his way toward the waterfront. He hadn't come empty-handed this time. In his large, calloused hand rested a premium roast beef and cheddar sandwich wrapped snugly in white butcher paper, purchased from Martha's Diner under the completely false guise of an unusually large breakfast appetite. When he reached the dilapidated pier, the morning fog had lifted just enough to reveal the dark, churning, violently cold water below. Echo was exactly where he had been the day before, a dark, tragic silhouette against the gray abyss, completely unbothered by the freezing ocean spray that coated his matted fur. Mason approached with slow, highly deliberate steps, making absolutely sure his heavy boots crunched loudly on the loose gravel before he stepped onto the wood so he wouldn't startle the highly strung animal. He stopped a few feet away, slowly unwrapped the sandwich, and broke off a generous, meat-heavy half. The rich, savory aroma of roasted beef cut sharply through the bitter, salty air. Echo's black nose twitched visibly. The dog's pointed ears swiveled backward, capturing the sound of the crinkling paper, but his sorrowful amber eyes remained firmly locked on the distant horizon. "Hey," Mason grunted softly, tossing the half sandwich so it landed with a soft thud just inches from the dog's front paws. "Eat it. You're nothing but skin and bones." Echo slowly lowered his massive, heavy head. He sniffed the offering with deliberate, agonizing slowness, taking in the scent of the food. For a fleeting, hopeful second, Mason thought his tactical feeding mission was a complete success. Instead, the proud shepherd let out a quiet, dismissive huff of air through his nose, lifted his head high with aristocratic disdain, and purposefully looked away, returning his unwavering gaze to the churning sea. Mason blinked, entirely taken aback by the sheer audacity of the animal. He was a highly decorated elite operator, a man who had successfully navigated deadly combat zones and survived harrowing tactical sieges. Yet here he was, being completely socially rejected by a starving, homeless canine. A rare, rusty scoff escaped Mason's lips, a sound that might have actually been a laugh if he still remembered how to make one. "Stubborn," he muttered, crossing his muscular arms over his chest. "Suit yourself, then." For the next hour, a strange, unspoken truce settled over the two battle-scarred veterans. Mason didn't leave the pier, and Echo didn't try to chase him away. They simply existed in a shared, heavy silence on the edge of the world, accompanied only by the deafening roar of the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the pilings. Eventually, Mason felt a strange, deeply unfamiliar urge to offer physical comfort to the grieving creature. He took a slow, measured step forward, closing the small distance between them. He crouched down on one knee, bringing himself down to the dog's eye level, and slowly extended his right hand. His palm was open, facing upward in a universal gesture of peace and offering. "You can't wait out here forever, buddy," Mason whispered, his gruff voice cracking slightly with a heavy, buried emotion he usually kept locked in the darkest corners of his mind. As his fingertips brushed within an inch of the dog's damp, coarse fur, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Echo didn't snap, bare his teeth, or bite, but a deep, vibrating rumble began deep within the dog's hollow chest, a low, serious warning growl that vibrated straight through the rotting wooden planks. The shepherd stiffened his front legs and took a single, deliberate step backward, creating a strict, impenetrable boundary. His amber eyes locked fiercely onto Mason's, flashing with a protective, desperate intensity. Mason immediately froze, his tactical training kicking in, slowly retracting his hand and raising both palms in an act of complete surrender. He didn't feel anger at the rejection. He felt a profound, crushing sense of clarity. Looking into those guarded, heartbroken eyes, Mason saw his own tragic reflection staring right back at him. Echo wasn't just guarding a piece of broken wood. He was fiercely guarding the precious memory of someone he loved, absolutely terrified that moving forward meant letting go of the past. Mason slowly stood up, the damp wind biting mercilessly at his face. He understood the dog's defensive growl perfectly because it was the exact same silent, aggressive warning he gave to the rest of the world every single day when anyone tried to get too close. They were both hopelessly tethered to the ghosts of their pasts, standing stubbornly on a crumbling edge, refusing to be rescued. Mason took a respectful step back, leaving the cold roast beef sitting on the wood. "Okay," Mason said softly, turning his collar up against the biting cold. "I get it. We hold the line." As he walked away, leaving the brave dog to his endless solitary vigil, Mason realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely alone in his purgatory. The delicate quiet of Oakhaven shattered 48 hours later. The suffocating fog that usually blanketed the coast was violently ripped away, replaced by a bruised, purple-black sky that seemed to sink heavily toward the restless ocean. Inside his drafty rented cabin, Mason listened intently as the local AM radio crackled to life, slicing through the tense morning air. The typically cheerful voice of the town broadcaster was replaced by a grim, synthesized emergency alert system, warning of a historic, late-season nor'easter rapidly approaching the coastline with hurricane-force winds. The barometric pressure was plummeting at an alarming rate, a physical shift Mason could literally feel deep within the old, aching shrapnel wounds of his legs. He didn't hesitate. Locals were rushing wildly to secure loose objects. Locals were rushing wildly to secure loose items, their faces pale with the sudden realization of the ocean's impending fury. Mason's military instincts, dormant but never truly extinguished, flared brilliantly to life. The overwhelming urge to protect and serve, the very core of his identity before the trauma of war had buried it, took complete control. He jogged toward the waterfront commercial strip, where the wind was already tearing violently at the weathered canvas awnings. There, struggling desperately with a massive sheet of plywood outside the local pharmacy, was Sheriff Sarah Miller. She was a lean, highly pragmatic woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight, no-nonsense bun and sharp, calculating eyes that usually missed absolutely nothing in her jurisdiction. Right now, however, she was losing a dangerous battle against the escalating gusts. "Hold the left corner," Mason barked, his low voice projecting easily and authoritatively over the rising howl of the wind. He didn't wait for her permission, stepping in effortlessly to brace the heavy wood flush against the brick frame with his broad shoulders while she quickly drove the thick metal screws home. Sheriff Miller shot him a brief, thoroughly evaluating look, noting his faded tactical jacket and the absolute, chilling absence of panic in his rigid posture. "You're the newcomer," she shouted over the deafening din, her power drill driving the last screw deep into the reinforced frame. "Elias said you were a quiet one. Didn't know you were incredibly useful, too." Mason offered a curt, singular nod, immediately scanning the chaotic street for the next critical vulnerability. "Where do you need me, Sheriff?" For the next 3 grueling hours, Mason became a silent, highly efficient force of nature himself, fighting the storm step for step. He moved methodically and relentlessly from storefront to storefront, expertly anticipating structural weaknesses and acting with absolute decisiveness. He helped Elias secure the violently rattling inventory of the bait shop and even reinforced the heavy glass windows of Martha's diner, moving with a disciplined urgency that instantly commanded the respect and obedience of the terrified locals. He didn't offer comforting words or hollow reassurances. His presence alone, steady and immovable as a bedrock, was enough to significantly anchor the rising panic swirling around him. The emergency radio broadcasts playing loudly from open car doors grew increasingly dire by the minute, reporting massive, unprecedented swells and passionately urging the immediate evacuation of all the lowest-lying coastal roads. The sky darkened completely, turning the mid-afternoon into a terrifying, premature night. Rain began to fall, not in distinct drops, but in horizontal, stinging sheets that felt exactly like shattered glass striking exposed skin. The ocean, usually a rhythmic, calming backdrop to the town, was now roaring like an enraged, wounded beast, violently throwing massive, frothing waves against the stone breakwaters with the force of artillery fire. The town's streetlights flickered dangerously for a few seconds before dying out completely, plunging Oakhaven into a chaotic, screaming darkness. With the final storm shutters locked securely in place and the last of the straggling residents firmly ushered into the sturdy, brick-built community center located safely on higher ground, Sheriff Miller placed a heavy, grateful hand on Mason's soaking wet shoulder. "That's everyone!" she yelled, her words barely audible over the absolute, deafening roar of the tempest. "We're officially locked down. Get inside, son. There's absolutely nothing left to save out here." Mason nodded, wiping the blinding, freezing rain from his eyes. His body ached with a deeply familiar, incredibly satisfying physical exhaustion, providing a temporary, highly welcome reprieve from the relentless mental fatigue that usually plagued his waking hours. He turned his body toward the reinforced steel doors of the shelter, genuinely ready to finally retreat from the violent elements. But as a brilliant, jagged flash of lightning briefly illuminated the apocalyptic coastal landscape, Mason's tactical gaze was instinctively drawn past the relative safety of the town, looking straight down the flooded main street toward the turbulent shoreline. His heart violently seized in his chest, stopping completely for a terrifying fraction of a second. The old fisherman's pier was barely visible through the torrential downpour, already partially submerged by the monstrous, rapidly swelling tide. The massive wooden pilings were audibly groaning and splintering under the brutal, relentless assault of the crashing waves. And there, at the very edge of the collapsing, doomed structure, completely exposed to the unfettered wrath of the Atlantic Ocean, was a small, incredibly defiant silhouette. It was Echo. The fiercely loyal German shepherd had not moved a single inch. Despite the hurricane-force winds actively threatening to physically tear his emaciated body from the rotting wood, and despite the freezing black water already beginning to wash violently over his paws, the dog remained rigidly planted at his post, staring blindly into the absolute darkness of the killer storm. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of the animal's stubborn devotion hit Mason with the staggering force of a physical blow. The dog was literally going to die, waiting for a ghost that was never coming home. The radio's final, crackling warning abruptly echoed in Mason's mind. Catastrophic storm surge, imminent. Another massive, terrifying wave crashed spectacularly against the pier, sending a thick spray of white water directly over the motionless animal. Mason didn't think. His training and his deeply buried humanity simply reacted in unison. The carefully constructed walls of his emotional isolation shattered completely in the face of that tragic, unyielding loyalty. He deliberately turned his back on the safety and warmth of the community center and sprinted directly into the heart of the howling abyss. The storm did not merely howl, it screamed with the agonizing pitch of tearing metal as Mason sprinted away from the fortified safety of the community center and back into the swallowing dark. The horizontal rain pelted fiercely against his soaked NWU Type 3 jacket, the heavy digital woodland fabric now clinging to his muscular frame like a freezing second skin. Every instinct honed by years of elite SEAL training demanded that he seek cover, to preserve his own life in the face of an insurmountable, hostile force. Yet his legs pumped furiously, driving his heavy tactical boots through ankle-deep floodwaters flowing rapidly down the desolate main street. He was no longer just a man running toward a ruined pier. He was a desperate soldier, violently hurtling back in time. With every thunderous crash of the ocean, the deafening noise of the hurricane morphed terrifyingly into the chaotic, ringing echoes of a distant desert firefight. He wasn't just trying to pull a stubborn, grieving German shepherd off a collapsing dock. In the fractured, bleeding corners of his mind, Mason was desperately trying to reach his fallen teammate, the young, bright-eyed operator whose life had slipped through Mason's blood-slicked fingers on a sun-baked rooftop thousands of miles away. The crushing weight of survivor's guilt propelled him forward, turning his frantic rescue mission into a deeply personal, brutal quest for redemption. He had failed to bring his brother home once. He absolutely refused to let the ocean claim another innocent soul on his watch. When Mason finally reached the shoreline, the sheer, devastating power of the Atlantic was fully unleashed. The old fisherman's pier was groaning in absolute agony, its massive wooden pilings violently shifting and snapping under the relentless assault of towering, frothing swells. At the very edge of the doomed structure, silhouetted against the stark, violent flashes of lightning, stood Echo. The dog was completely submerged in a foot of rushing salt water, his matted fur plastered flat against his emaciated body, fighting desperately to keep his footing on the slick, rotting wood. Mason threw himself onto the treacherous pier, dropping to his hands and knees to lower his center of gravity against the hurricane-force gusts. The wood beneath him buckled dangerously with every incoming wave. "Echo!" Mason roared, his gritty voice instantly swallowed by the roaring tempest. He crawled forward with agonizing slowness, salt water burning his eyes and filling his lungs. "Come here, we have to go." The dog turned his head, his amber eyes wide with raw, unadulterated terror. But Echo didn't move toward the safety of the shore. Instead, he planted his bleeding paws firmer into the splintering planks, lowering his head in a defensive, rigid posture. He was absolutely terrified of the storm, but he was infinitely more terrified of abandoning the exact spot where his master had last been seen. If he left now, the ghost would never find him. Mason closed the final distance, reaching out with a desperate, soaked hand to grab the dog's frayed canvas collar. As his fingers brushed the wet fabric, panic completely overtook the traumatized animal. Echo lunged forward, his primal survival instincts clashing violently with his blinding grief, and sank his sharp teeth deep into Mason's thick forearm. A sharp, searing pain shot up Mason's arm, and warm blood instantly mixed with the freezing rain washing over his skin. The bite was deep, a frantic warning from a broken creature pushed far beyond its mental limit. Mason didn't pull away. He didn't yell in anger or strike the animal. He simply looked directly into Echo's wild, panicked eyes, completely ignoring the tearing pain in his flesh. "I know," Mason yelled softly over the wind, his voice cracking with a profound, shared agony. "I know you're waiting for him. I know it hurts to leave. But he isn't coming back, buddy. They never come back." The words were meant for the dog, but they tore through Mason's own heart, an absolute devastating admission of the truth he had been running from for years. He tightened his grip on the dog's collar, preparing to forcefully drag the heavy animal backward. "I am not leaving you behind!" he screamed into the storm. Before Mason could pull, a terrifying, unnatural silence suddenly sucked the air from the atmosphere, the water rapidly receding from the shoreline in a sickening drop. Mason looked up, his blood running entirely cold. A rogue wave, a monstrous, towering wall of pitch-black water, was rising silently from the chaotic ocean, completely eclipsing the little light left in the sky. There was absolutely no time to brace, no time to run. "Hold on!" Mason bellowed, wrapping his thick arms entirely around the dog's trembling body. The impact was equivalent to being hit by a freight train. The massive wave crashed down with catastrophic force, completely obliterating the final remaining section of the rotting pier. The violent surge of freezing, dark water instantly swallowed them both, violently tearing the thick wooden planks into useless splinters. Mason was thrown backward, brutally submerged into a chaotic, spinning abyss. The sheer cold of the water shocked his system, forcefully driving the remaining air from his burning lungs. He tumbled helplessly underwater, completely disoriented in the pitch-black washing machine of the roaring ocean, the violent currents trying to drag him straight down to the ocean floor. His injured arm throbbed numbly. He fought instinctively toward where he thought the surface was, his heavy boots and soaked uniform pulling him down like iron weights. As his muscles began to burn and fail, a dark, seductive thought crept into the edges of his fading consciousness. It would be so incredibly easy to just stop fighting, to let the dark, freezing water finally wash away the guilt, the exhaustion, and the endless screaming memories. He had tried to save the dog. He had done his best. Surrender felt like a warm, inviting blanket in the freezing depths. He stopped kicking. Just as Mason began to slip into the peaceful void, a frantic, muffled splash broke through the roaring underwater chaos above him. Through the dark, swirling water, something forcefully grabbed the thick collar of his tactical jacket. It was a vicious, unyielding grip. Mason was violently yanked upward, bursting through the surface of the water with a desperate, gasping breath of air. The howling wind instantly assaulted his face again. He wiped the blinding salt water from his eyes and looked up. Treading water furiously in the violent swells, his jaws locked tenaciously onto the fabric of Mason's uniform, was Echo. The dog was struggling immensely against the massive waves, coughing up seawater, but his amber eyes were burning with a fierce, absolute determination. Echo had let go of the destroyed pier. He had let go of the ghost he had been waiting for. In the face of death, the broken, grieving dog had made a profound, definitive choice. He plunged into the terrifying abyss not to drown with his past, but to desperately pull the only living person who cared about him back into the present. A renewed, explosive surge of adrenaline and profound gratitude shot through Mason's veins. "I've got you," Mason choked out, wrapping his good arm around the dog's exhausted torso. Together, man and dog fought fiercely against the retreating tide, battling the towering, unforgiving surf inch by brutal inch, until the surging waves finally violently deposited them onto the rocky, debris-strewn safety of the higher shoreline, leaving them both gasping, bleeding, and irrevocably bonded in the stormy darkness. The freezing sand felt like ground glass against Mason's cheek, but to a man who had just accepted the cold embrace of the ocean, it felt like absolute paradise. He lay heavily on the jagged, debris-littered shoreline, his chest heaving violently as he sucked in greedy lungfuls of the stormy air. Beside him, a dark, shivering mass was pressed firmly against his side. Echo. The German shepherd lay completely exhausted, his matted fur dripping salt water onto the stones, his breathing a harsh, ragged wheeze. Mason slowly forced himself to sit up, his muscles screaming in protest. His right arm throbbed a dull, angry rhythm where Echo's teeth had punctured the skin, but he ignored it. He reached out with his left hand, resting it gently on the dog's rising flank. Echo didn't growl. Instead, the dog let out a long, heavy sigh and rested his wet chin directly on Mason's thigh. The war between them was over. The ocean had washed it away. As the brutal winds of the nor'easter finally began to break, leaving behind a bruised, weeping sky, Mason painfully hauled himself to his feet. "Come on," he rasped, his voice raw from the salt water. "Let's go home." He didn't use a leash. He didn't need to. As Mason limped agonizingly up the flooded coastal road toward his secluded cabin, the battered, limping dog stayed glued to his heel, an unbreakable shadow forged in the freezing depths. The next morning brought a fragile, pale sunlight that pierced through the thinning clouds, illuminating the extensive damage Oakhaven had endured. Before settling into the cabin, Mason knew they both needed medical attention. He drove his battered truck to the edge of town to see Dr. Harrison Vance, the local veterinarian who also routinely patched up stubborn fishermen who refused to visit the mainland hospital. Dr. Vance was a tall, remarkably thin man in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed silver beard, thick tortoise-shell glasses, and a calm, deliberate manner that radiated instant reassurance. He wore a faded plaid shirt beneath a pristine white coat, his pockets bulging with an assortment of treats and medical tape. The vet meticulously cleaned and stitched the deep puncture wounds on Mason's forearm with practiced efficiency before turning his gentle attention to Echo. Amazingly, despite the starvation and the freezing ocean, the dog's vitals were strong. "He's severely malnourished and exhausted, but his spirit is entirely intact," Dr. Vance noted softly, offering Echo a piece of dried liver that the dog tentatively accepted. "He needs warmth, high-protein food, and absolute safety. I think you two can provide that for each other." Mason paid the man in cash, a silent, mutual understanding passing between them, and drove his new companion back to the quiet sanctuary of the wooden cabin. Returning to the cabin, Mason immediately set to work, building a massive fire in the stone hearth, the crackling dry wood slowly pushing the damp chill out of the room. Echo's transition to indoor life was a deeply fascinating, often humorous process to observe. The rugged survivalist dog, who had stoically faced a hurricane, was intensely suspicious of modern domestic conveniences. Later that afternoon, when Mason pulled an old upright vacuum cleaner from the closet to clear away the dried mud they had tracked in, chaos ensued. The moment the machine roared to life, Echo scrambled backward with comical haste, his paws slipping wildly on the hardwood floor. He let out a sharp, highly offended bark, treating the noisy appliance like a deadly, mechanized predator, and promptly retreated behind the safety of the living room sofa until Mason turned it off with a rare, genuine smirk. The stubborn independence that had kept Echo alive on the pier quickly morphed into a comfortable, territorial claim over the cabin. By nightfall, Mason walked into his small bedroom to find the massive 90-pound German Shepherd sprawled luxuriously across the exact center of his mattress. Echo's eyes were closed, softly snoring, completely unapologetic about his bold theft. Mason stood in the doorway, staring at the only bed in the house, before letting out a soft, resigned sigh. He grabbed a spare wool blanket from the closet and made a makeshift bed on the floor next to the mattress. For the first time in his life, yielding his territory didn't feel like a defeat. However, the peacefulness of the evening was a fragile illusion that completely shattered in the dead of night. The fire had died down to glowing embers when the familiar, terrifying demons came for Mason. In his sleep, the sound of the ocean wind morphed seamlessly into the deafening, rhythmic chop of a Black Hawk helicopter. He wasn't in the cabin anymore. He was back in the suffocating, dust-choked heat of the Middle East. Gunfire cracked like thunder. The metallic tang of blood flooded his mouth. He was desperately holding on to his young teammate, applying frantic, useless pressure to a catastrophic wound, screaming for a medic that was never going to arrive. The boy's eyes went completely blank, staring into nothing. And suddenly the sand turned into freezing black water, dragging them both down into the abyss. Mason violently jolted awake, a strangled, raw shout tearing from his throat. He shot upright, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his entire body drenched in a cold, shivering sweat. The room was dark, the shadows dancing menacingly on the walls. He couldn't breathe, his lungs frantically grasping for air that wouldn't come. The panic attack was a suffocating physical weight, a total loss of reality. Then a heavy, solid warmth pressed firmly against his shaking chest. Echo had jumped down from the bed and stepped directly into Mason's lap. The large dog didn't whine or panic. He simply laid his heavy, reassuring head over Mason's racing heart, applying a deep, steadying pressure. Echo let out a low, calm breath, grounding the terrified soldier in the present moment. Mason closed his eyes tightly, burying his face into the dog's thick, warm neck, his trembling hands clutching the coarse fur like a lifeline. Slowly, agonizingly, the phantom gunfire faded away, replaced by the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the animal in his arms. The ghosts retreated back into the shadows. As Mason sat there on the cold wooden floor, holding the dog who had saved him twice, a profound, entirely unfamiliar peace finally settled over his fractured soul. He was finally, truly safe. The morning after the storm brought a profound, cleansing stillness to the coastal town of Oakhaven, leaving the air smelling sharply of crushed pine needles and salt. Inside the warm cabin, the crackling fire had reduced to a steady, comforting glow. Mason stood by the small kitchen counter, methodically preparing a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and plain oats, deliberately making a double portion. Echo lay nearby on the braided rug, his breathing finally deep and even, though his usually majestic black and tan coat was a chaotic, stiff mess of dried saltwater, sand, and matted debris. After they ate in comfortable silence, Mason decided it was time to rid the animal of the filthy, restrictive canvas collar that was clearly chafing his thin neck. He knelt beside the German shepherd, murmuring softly as he unbuckled the heavy, rusted metal clasp. The collar was thick, military-grade webbing, but it was incredibly rigid from months of exposure to the harsh ocean elements. As Mason took it to the stainless steel sink and began scrubbing it with a stiff brush and warm soapy water, he felt an unnatural hard lump sewn securely into the inner lining near the buckle. It wasn't a standard pet identification chip or a simple plastic tag. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable curiosity, Mason retrieved his tactical folding knife from his pocket and carefully snipped the thick, dark nylon threads holding the secret pocket shut. A small, heavily tarnished brass pendant slipped out, clinking sharply against the metal basin. Mason picked it up, wiping away years of accumulated sea grime with his thumb. It wasn't a dog tag meant for a canine, it was a military-issue identification tag. The breath violently left Mason's lungs as if he had just been struck forcefully in the chest by a physical blow. Engraved deeply into the worn brass was a name and a 10-digit service number. Elias Thorne, USN. The name struck Mason's core with absolute, paralyzing devastation. It was the exact service number burned permanently into his own memory. It belonged to the young, fiercely optimistic SEAL who had bled to death in Mason's arms beneath an unforgiving, sun-baked desert sky thousands of miles away. Mason's strong, scarred hands began to tremble noticeably, a rare and alarming betrayal of his deeply ingrained physical control. He stared blindly at the brass tag, the edges worn perfectly smooth by time and friction, his mind violently rejecting the impossible coincidence. How could a piece of his fallen brother end up hidden on a stray dog at the lonely edge of the world? Memories of Elias flooded his mind. The kid had always talked affectionately about his grandfather, a retired machinist who lived on the rugged coastline, a man who had taught him how to navigate the stars and respect the tides. The walls of the small cabin suddenly felt suffocatingly tight, pressing in on Mason's chest. He looked over at Echo, who was watching him intently from the rug, his amber eyes tilted in silent, innocent question. Mason grabbed his truck keys, his faded jacket, and the brass tag, leaving the cabin with a quiet, hollow command for the dog to stay. He drove his battered truck into town, the heavy tires splashing recklessly through the deep, muddy puddles left behind by the nor'easter. He pushed forcefully through the heavy glass door of the local precinct. Sheriff Sarah Miller was sitting behind her cluttered wooden desk, aggressively sorting through stacks of post-storm structural damage reports. She looked up, her sharp, calculating eyes immediately registering the pale, profoundly haunted expression completely dominating Mason's usually stoic face. She dropped her pen, her pragmatic demeanor softening instantly. "Mason, what's wrong? Is it the dog? Did the wound get infected?" she asked rapidly. Mason walked straight to her desk, completely ignoring the questions, and placed the tarnished brass pendant directly onto the scarred wood between them. "The old man who owned Echo," Mason stated, his voice a low, urgent, and desperate rasp. "The one Elias Cobb said died in the squall a few months ago." "What was his name, Sheriff? I need to know his exact name right now." Sarah frowned deeply, picking up the heavy brass tag with a delicate touch. She studied the worn engraving, her expression shifting visibly from mild confusion to profound, heartbreaking sorrow. "His name was Arthur Thorne," she answered quietly, folding her hands tightly over the file folders on her desk. "He moved into that isolated cabin up on the ridge about 3 years ago. Kept entirely to himself, just fished and read. The only thing he ever really talked about to anyone in town was his grandson, a bright Navy boy, killed in action overseas." She looked up, meeting Mason's desperate, shattered gaze with absolute empathy. "Arthur got the dog from a rescue right after the military funeral. He named him Echo, told me once that the dog was the absolute last living piece of the boy's voice left in this world. When Arthur's boat went down in that storm last month, Echo lost the only family he had left. Again." The absolute staggering weight of the truth crashed down on Mason, infinitely heavier and far more devastating than the massive rogue wave that had nearly drowned them the night before. The carefully constructed, protective lie he had been telling himself, that he had simply come to Oakhaven at random to disappear into the fog, evaporated instantly into the cold air. He had deliberately tracked Arthur Thorne to this desolate, forgotten coastline. He had come here carrying Elias's blood-stained personal journal, intending to look the grieving old man directly in the eye and apologize for utterly failing to bring his grandson home. But paralyzed by his own crushing cowardice, survivor's guilt, and the sheer terror of facing the family of the fallen, Mason had intentionally delayed the visit. He had spent weeks drinking coffee in the diner, aimlessly wandering the misty beaches, hopelessly waiting for a courage that never materialized. He had waited entirely too long. Arthur was dead. The old man had drowned alone in the freezing water, and Mason was too late to grant him peace. The ghost that Echo had been faithfully, stubbornly waiting for on that rotting pier wasn't just a beloved master, it was Arthur Thorne. They had both been hopelessly, tragically tethered to the exact same loss. The broken dog waiting on the dock and the broken soldier hiding in the fog were fiercely mourning the exact same bloodline. Echo was not a random stray the ocean had thrown in his path. He was the absolute last living connection to Elias. Mason stumbled backward slightly, his hand blindly gripping the edge of the heavy oak doorframe for physical support as tears finally blurred his vision. The universe had not brought him to this town to hide. It had dragged him here by his throat to answer a debt. The drive back to the secluded cabin was a suffocating blur for Mason. The crushing weight of the revelation at the sheriff's office pressed heavily against his chest, making each breath feel like inhaling crushed glass. When he pushed open the heavy wooden door of his home, Echo immediately lifted his massive head from the braided rug, his tail giving a tentative, hopeful thump against the floorboards. The dog's amber eyes, once a source of profound comfort, now felt like a piercing spotlight illuminating Mason's deepest failures. Mason froze in the doorway, his hand gripping the brass identification tag deeply embedded in his palm. He looked at the loyal German shepherd and saw only the devastating consequences of his own cowardice. He had failed to bring Elias home from the scorching desert, and by selfishly hiding in the fog of his own survivor's guilt, he had completely failed to bring Arthur Thorne any measure of peace before the ocean claimed him. A dark, bitter voice whispered in Mason's mind, telling him he was utterly unworthy of the animal's unconditional affection. He deliberately averted his gaze, his jaw clenched tight, and walked right past the welcoming dog without a single word or touch. He retreated into the small kitchen, aggressively putting physical distance between them. Echo whined softly, a high-pitched sound of pure confusion, and trotted after him, nudging his wet nose against Mason's rigid hand. "No," Mason commanded harshly, pulling his arm away, as if the dog's fur burned his skin. "Stay back." He grabbed his faded NWU Type 3 jacket from the back of a wooden chair, throwing it on to block out the sudden, bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the coastal weather, and immediately walked back out the front door, leaving the bewildered dog completely alone inside. Seeking refuge from the haunting silence of the cabin, Mason wandered aimlessly down the rocky, debris-strewn shoreline, punishing himself with the freezing coastal wind. He needed the physical discomfort to drown out the agonizing screams of his own conscience. As he navigated a treacherous stretch of slippery, moss-covered boulders, he encountered a lone figure carefully untangling a large piece of driftwood from a shattered fishing net. It was Pastor Thomas, the local clergyman of Oakhaven. The pastor was a short, remarkably sturdy man in his late 60s, with kind, crinkling eyes behind round, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a thick, salt-stained wool sweater tightly buttoned over his stiff clerical collar. He possessed the quiet, immovable presence of a man who had spent decades counseling a town constantly at the mercy of the sea. "The ocean took a lot from us this week, but it seems to have spared you, son," Pastor Thomas noted mildly, pausing his work to look at the deeply troubled veteran. Mason stopped, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "It spared the wrong man," Mason replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp laced with absolute bitterness. "I came here to give Arthur Thorne an apology. I waited too long. Now he's dead, and I'm stuck with his grandson's dog. I don't deserve the animal. I should just leave." Pastor Thomas wiped his muddy hands on a rag, his expression entirely devoid of judgment, but full of a sharp, piercing clarity. Arthur was a man of the tides. He understood that you cannot control when the storm hits. You can only control who you pull out of the wreckage, the pastor said softly. That dog spent months stubbornly waiting for a ghost, nearly killing himself in the process. Now, you are doing the exact same thing. You are punishing the living to somehow appease the dead. Arthur wouldn't want that dog abandoned again, and I suspect whatever brother you lost wouldn't want you wandering this beach like a hollow shell. The old man turned back to his driftwood, leaving the profound words hanging heavily in the salty air. Mason returned to the cabin hours later, the afternoon sun finally casting long, golden shadows across the damp earth. He expected Echo to be cowering or aloof, but the moment he opened the door, 90 pounds of determined German Shepherd immediately blocked his path. Mason tried to step around him, seeking the isolation of the bedroom, but Echo deliberately mirrored his movements, firmly planting his broad chest in the way. The dog let out a sharp, demanding bark. There was absolutely no fear in his amber eyes, only a fierce, animalistic stubbornness. Echo nudged his heavy head forcefully under Mason's hand, flipping the man's palm upward. Mason tried to pull away, grumbling a half-hearted dismissal, but the dog simply leaned his entire body weight against Mason's legs, effectively trapping him against the doorframe. It was a slightly comical, highly aggressive display of affection. The dog, having narrowly survived the storm by finally letting go of the past, was completely refusing to let the human make the exact same lethal mistake. The absolute absurdity of being physically bullied into emotional acceptance by a stray dog finally broke through Mason's ironclad defenses. A short, breathless sound escaped his chest, a genuine, broken laugh. He slowly sank to his knees, burying his face in the thick, coarse fur of the dog's neck. "You stubborn, relentless mutt!" Mason whispered fiercely, his tears soaking into the dark coat. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Echo simply let out a long, contented sigh, resting his chin heavily on Mason's shoulder, anchoring him firmly to the present. The following morning, the sky over Oakhaven was a brilliant, unblemished blue, the oppressive fog entirely banished by the changing winds. Mason stood by the small wooden desk in his bedroom, picking up the tarnished brass dog tag and a small, deeply weathered leather journal he had carried in his tactical pack for years. Elias's journal. He tucked them safely into his pocket and looked down at Echo. "Let's go," he said quietly. They walked together side by side, not toward the town, but directly toward the waterfront. They reached the shoreline where the old fisherman's pier used to stand. The violent storm had completely obliterated the structure. Only a few jagged, broken pilings protruded like rotten teeth from the calm, rolling surf. There was absolutely nothing left to wait for. Mason walked right up to the water's edge, the gentle morning tide washing softly over the toes of his heavy boots. He pulled the dog tag and the leather journal from his pocket, holding them tightly for one final suspended moment. He looked out at the vast, endless horizon, the boundary where the sky met the sea. "I'm sorry I didn't bring you home, Elias," Mason spoke aloud, his voice steady and remarkably clear in the quiet morning air. "And I'm sorry I was too late, Arthur, but I've got him now. I swear to you, I've got him." With a powerful, sweeping motion of his arm, Mason threw the heavy journal and the brass tag far out into the deep water. They arced beautifully in the sunlight before slipping silently beneath the ocean's surface, sinking into the peaceful abyss. Echo let out a single, sharp bark, sitting tall and proud by Mason's side. Neither of them was looking down at the broken wood or searching the water for returning ghosts. Together, the soldier and the dog stood firmly on the shoreline, their eyes locked entirely on the bright, unbroken horizon. The thick, suffocating fog that had defined the coastal town of Oakhaven for so long finally surrendered to the undeniable warmth of the arriving spring. It was a slow, beautiful awakening. The perpetual gray canvas of the sky was painted over with brilliant strokes of cerulean blue, and the vibrant, eager green of coastal pines shook off the heavy winter frost. Sunlight, bright and completely unapologetic, pierced through the remaining wisps of morning mist, making the vast Atlantic Ocean sparkle like a boundless field of shattered diamonds instead of a dark, brooding abyss. The town itself seemed to collectively exhale. Fishermen whistled as they applied fresh coats of bright paint to their weathered skiffs, and the heavy, sweet scent of blooming wildflowers mixed seamlessly with the salty sea breeze. For Mason, this dramatic changing of the seasons perfectly mirrored the profound seismic shift within his own chest. The crushing, suffocating weight of his survivor's guilt had not magically vanished. The deep scars of war and loss rarely ever do, but it had fundamentally transformed from a paralyzing anchor into a powerful driving source of strength. He no longer wore his faded camo jacket as a heavy shroud of penance or a barrier against the world. Instead, it had simply become a durable, highly practical piece of gear for his new daily mission. He had finally found a new compass. Walking briskly through the bustling morning docks, Mason felt an incredibly unfamiliar lightness in his heavy tactical boots. Beside him, trotting with a renewed, majestic confidence that commanded the attention of everyone they passed, was Echo. The German shepherd's coat, once a severely matted testament to starvation and blinding grief, now gleamed with supreme health, showcasing a rich, thick tapestry of deep black and vibrant tan. They were heading purposefully toward the regional training grounds just outside the town limits, stepping firmly and deliberately into a bright future they had fought so desperately to secure together. The sprawling, rugged terrain of the coastal reserve served as the absolute perfect proving ground for the regional search and rescue volunteer unit. Standing patiently by a complex line of brightly colored wooden obstacle courses and dense, unpredictable woodland trails was Chief Instructor Mark Lawson. Mark was a barrel-chested, deeply pragmatic man in his early 50s with a thick, neatly trimmed salt and pepper mustache, deeply tanned skin from decades of relentless outdoor work, and an authoritative yet highly encouraging voice that naturally commanded immediate attention. He wore a high-visibility orange vest over a simple, faded gray sweatshirt, holding a heavy metal clipboard like it was a tactical shield. All right, Mason, let's see if that incredibly stubborn hound of yours actually knows how to use his nose for something other than sniffing out Martha's premium roast beef sandwiches from half a mile away, Mark called out, a good-natured, challenging smirk wrinkling the deep corners of his eyes. We've got a highly complex simulated Lost Hiker scenario set up in Sector 4. The terrain is rough, the wind is shifting, and the scent trail is intentionally broken. Go. Mason offered a sharp, highly focused nod, the familiar thrill of a crucial objective sharpening his senses. He tapped his thigh twice with his hand. "Search, Echo," he commanded clearly, his deep voice ringing with absolute trust. The massive dog didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. Echo dropped his wet nose to the damp earth, his pointed ears swiveling like highly tuned radar dishes, immediately locking onto the designated scent trail. The sheer, irrational stubbornness that had once kept the grieving dog frozen on a collapsing, doomed pier was now brilliantly and productively channeled into an unstoppable, relentless drive to track and find. They moved swiftly through the dense, thorny brush as a perfect, highly synchronized tactical unit. Mason read the subtle, rapid shifts in the dog's body language, a sudden flick of the bushy tail, a sharp pivot of the head, a low, concentrated sniff, with the exact same intense, life-saving precision he had once used to navigate deadly, active combat zones in the Middle East. When Echo finally let out a booming, incredibly triumphant bark beside a hidden volunteer who was tucked deeply under a camouflaged emergency tarp, a genuine, wide smile broke completely across Mason's scarred face. "Good boy," Mason praised softly, tossing the dog his favorite tennis ball. Mark Lawson walked up, clicking his stopwatch with an impressed whistle. "I've been training dogs for 20 years, son, and you two move like you've been reading each other's minds for a decade," Mark noted, jotting down a perfect score on his clipboard. Mason looked at Echo, who was happily chewing the ball. The suffocating darkness of their shared past had been successfully and beautifully repurposed into a brilliant beacon of hope for others. They weren't just merely surviving day by day anymore. They were actively preparing to save lives. As the rigorous, physically demanding training day finally concluded, the golden hour rapidly approached, casting long, incredibly warm shadows across the rugged coastal landscape. Instead of heading straight back to the quiet comfort of their wooden cabin, Mason led Echo up the winding, steep dirt path that climbed steadily to the absolute highest point of Oakhaven, a towering, sheer granite cliff face that proudly overlooked the vast, glittering expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The rapid pacing of the entire world seemed to deliberately and gracefully slow down as they finally reached the flat, grassy summit. The violent, crashing roar of the heavy surf far below was gently muted to a rhythmic, soothing whisper by the sheer, dizzying altitude. The ocean breeze was crisp, clean, and highly invigorating, carrying the distinct, joyful promise of the approaching summer rather than the bitter, biting chill of lingering ghosts. Mason stood near the very edge, his heavy boots planted firmly and confidently on the solid stone, while Echo sat tall and proudly at his immediate right, his amber eyes clear, bright, and intensely focused. Neither of them was looking down at the jagged, unforgiving rocks below, nor were they desperately searching the rolling water for broken ships and lost souls that would absolutely never return. Their united gaze was locked entirely on the brilliant, endless horizon, their hearts and minds completely open to whatever new adventures tomorrow might bravely bring. Mason rested his large, calloused hand gently on the dog's broad, warm head, his thumb lightly and affectionately brushing the sturdy, brand-new leather collar securely fastened around the animal's thick neck. The heavy, poignant silence between the soldier and the dog was absolutely no longer filled with agonizing, unspoken grief, but rather with a profound, deeply settled gratitude. As the vibrant, fiery colors of the setting sun painted the sky in magnificent shades of gold and crimson, a deep, resonant truth finally settled completely over the scarred Navy SEAL, serving as the perfect poetic epilogue to their stormy, harrowing journey. Sometimes, to save a soul, you have to let that soul save you first. If this story brought you some comfort or a new perspective, please share it with someone who might be weathering their own storm right now. I would love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below and tell me about a time you found the strength to let go and move forward. Your personal stories inspire me to keep creating every single day. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can continue this beautiful journey of growth and healing together. Until next time, keep looking toward the horizon.